context rebuttal brought forth by the rabbis regarding Isaiah 7:14, to the best of my knowledge, has not been clearly dealt with by the Christian community. But let me know in the comments section if I am wrong. Let me just add on the dual prophecy explanation that I have to agree with the rabbis that it is nothing more than nonsense, and in fact corroborates the rabbis' argument about the context not being able to support Matthew and his virgin birth prophecy. What is the context rebuttal, you ask? Put simply, it has a few parts to it. First, you have to basically ignore that Isaiah 7 verses 1 to 19 and Isaiah 7:10 verses 10 to 25 were spoken at different times between Ahaz and Isaiah. Second, Alma, the word non-heretical Christians translate as virgin, has to be translated as young woman. If not, I'd add, it rebuts the context the rabbis are claiming, because biblical history does not teach of a virgin birth in the time of Isaiah, and I don't think that there could have been such an oversight on that issue. Any reasonable person would just allow the context tension to remain, even if they could not rebut the context being brought forth by the rabbis. The last part of this theological coup d'etat is just a simple, blatant lie, but everyone misses it. So with the lie and the false context that has been created, all you got to do is slap verses 15 and 16 together with verse 14, and like the waving of a magic wand, watch what happens. Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God, make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin, or a young woman, will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. He will eat curds of honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. The key part of the rabbinical rebuke rests in the lie that the last two verses that I read, which Rabbi Singer states in his book, Let's Get Biblical, Volume 2, New Expanded Edition, page 41, and I quote, that by the time the child reaches the age of maturity, he knows to reject bad and choose good, the two warring kings, Pekah and Reza, will have been removed. End quote. Rabbi Singer goes on to say that this was fulfilled in 2 Kings 15 and 16 when both kings were assassinated. With this argument, the rabbis have basically reduced the gospel to nothing more than a conspiracy theory trumped up with arguments that lack a contextual basis. However, the rabbi is mistaken, and it is they that lack a contextual basis. In verses 10 to 25 of Isaiah chapter 7, it is the second time God, through Isaiah, speaks to King Ahaz, king of Judah. The first time Isaiah made it clear at the beginning of the chapter, verses 1 to 9, that Pekah, king of Israel, and Reza, king of Aram, would not prevail and subdue Jerusalem to set up a puppet king who they named Tabeel. All Ahaz had to do was trust God's prophet at the beginning of the chapter. This is why Isaiah says in verse 9 of chapter 7, if you will not believe, you surely will not last. But Ahaz didn't trust these words of Isaiah, and it is easy to prove. So Isaiah had to return to Ahaz a second time, not to comfort him, like Rabbi Singer claims, but in judgment. So then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Right away, it is obvious to see that there is a break from the first 9 verses of chapter 7. And breaking this chapter into 2 parts is pivotal in understanding what is happening. The Lord spoke again to Ahaz. There is no other way to interpret this. It is a break in the chapter. But what happened in the meantime between verse 9 and 10 till we get to the second conversation well, the king of Judah got very busy. Very busy not trusting God. Isaiah said basically, just trust God. You won't be conquered. But the king of Judah was taking heavy casualties all around. For Pekah, son of Remaliah, slew in Judah 120,000 in one day, all valiant men, because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. So Ahaz looked around at the circumstances that were surrounding him and all the death and destruction that he was facing, rather than the words of God. And he hired the king of Assyria to take down the two kings that God told him not to worry about at the beginning of chapter 7. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and deliver me from the hand of the king of Aram and the hand of the king of Israel, who are rising up against me. Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria listened to him. We know the chronology of verses 10 to 25 of Isaiah chapter 7 came after Ahaz had shown a lack in faith of God, being able to protect him from the two kings, because of what Isaiah 7:20 says. In that day the Lord will shave with a razor, hired from the regions beyond the Euphrates, that is the king of Assyria, the head and the hair and the legs, and it will also shave the beard. Shaved with a razor was what happened to captives and was an expression of disgrace. Ahaz was being called out for his crime in trusting the nations and their gods, which was a must in any treaty alliance with a foreign king, and becoming the servant or son of the king of Assyria rather than a servant of the great God of Israel. What we have after Isaiah 7:14 happened after the hiring of the king of Assyria to take down Pekah and Reza, which is what the hired king, hired from the regions beyond the Euphrates, did with Rezin. But Pekah was assassinated by his own people. So the king of Assyria listened to him. And the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and captured it, and carried the people of it away into exile to Kir, and put Reza to death. As 2 Kings 15:29 states, the king of Assyria also did damage to Pekah, but did not kill him. The context of these verses that are in question after Isaiah 7:10, and we have to read them all the way to verse 25 to get the context properly, were that Ahaz was manipulating the downfall of these two kings by his payment in part from the temple treasuries to the king of Assyria, another king of Judah who was an utter faith failure. Isaiah was there a second time to let him know his lack of faith, or his failure to stand in a lack of knowledge, and his manipulation of world history had not gone unnoticed by God. Ahaz doubted Isaiah at the beginning of chapter 7 and thought God was not with him. Ahaz heard from God through Isaiah that the virgin was going to give birth and could probably connect the dots to be the king of Judah. I'll deal with the word virgin in part 2. What was probably going through Ahaz's mind at the time was who was the father. Then he hears the words Emmanuel, which means God is with us. A rebuttal to Ahaz. The king of Judah, who hears this prophecy by Isaiah, thought that God was not with him. You ask, how do I know what is going on in Ahaz's mind? Well, that's simple. When Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord, in reference to Ahaz not needing a sign from God, Ahaz was referring to a story back in Exodus 17, where in verse 2, Moses said, why do you test the Lord? The Israelites were thirsty and thought that Moses brought them out of Egypt to kill them in the wilderness by depriving them with water. Having said that, in the story Ahaz is quoting from in verse 7 of Exodus, it says that the Israelites tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? With Ahaz's quote of this same story, we get the exact story he was meditating on. and like his ancestors, he too had been doubting whether God was with him. Isaiah's Emmanuel is again a rebuttal, Rabbi Singer. Rabbi Singer asked the question, what possible comfort and assurance would Ahaz, who was surrounded by two overwhelming military enemies, have found in the birth of a child 7 centuries later? The prophecy was not supposed to be a comfort, Rabbi, but a rebuke to the alliance that Ahaz already made with the king of Assyria. If you had known the context, you would not be asking such childish questions. Ahaz was in a lack of knowledge about how to defeat Pekah, king of Israel, and Reza, king of Aram, by faith alone. Without making an alliance with the king of Assyria and accepting the Assyrian gods as part of that alliance, which was a must for any alliance and happened according to 2 Kings 16, 10-14. Ahaz was already testing the Lord, like Israel in the wilderness, and the Lord's patience. God made that known to him. Isaiah was rebutting him. That's the context. Now King Ahaz went down to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw the altar which was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent Uriah the priest the pattern of the altar and its model, according to all its workmanship. So Uriah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent to him from Damascus. Thus Uriah the priest made it before the coming of King Ahaz from Damascus. When the king came from Damascus, the king saw the altar. Then the king approached the altar and went up to it, and burnt his burnt offering, his meal offering, and poured out his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offering on the altar. All of this took place between verses 9 and 10 of Isaiah chapter 7. But ignorance is bliss.
So this is what you have to buy into to go to church. You have to believe that Isaiah is going to Ahaz and say, hey buddy, I know things look pretty bad, huh? Bleak? Yeah, I know. But I got good news for you. I'll tell you, here's the good news. In 700 years from now, this must have been really comforted.
But what about Rabbi Singer's comment in his book, Let's Get Biblical, Volume 2, New Expanded Edition, page 41? And I quote again, by the time this child reaches the age of maturity, he knows to reject bad and choose good. The two warring kings, Pekah and Reza, will have been removed. You may already know that I am a biblical textualist, which just means I let the text do the talking as much as possible. And if you could, please look at these verses, especially if you're a student of Tovia Singer, and show me, please, especially put this in the comments section, show me where it says that these two kings, Pekah and Reza, are going to die. I'll even play some music. The truth is that the text does not say that, nor is there any reason to infer it, because this is the second conversation, and the conversation was a rebuttal to the testing of Ahaz's patience on God. Isaiah goes on further about this child and says he is the owner of the land of Israel, and the government is upon his shoulders. It couldn't become more clearer. God owns the land of Israel, and it is He who will die the sacrificial death, according to Isaiah 53. So what is meant by Isaiah's, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken? One might be tempted to think the total deportation of the northern population. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried away Israel into exile to Assyria. and settled them in Halah and Habor, and on the river Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. It seems like this is an acceptable option given that God says this in Leviticus, "For the land shall lie forsaken without them, and shall be paid her Sabbath, while she lieth desolate without them, and they shall be paid the punishment of their iniquity, because they rejected my ordinances." It is the same word forsaken in the Hebrew, and the Israelites had been deported. And the context of this verse suggests, while the land lieth desolate, the Israelites will be in the land of their enemies. But the land did not get paid her Sabbaths and did not lie desolate, because the land was re-inhabited. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, "The people you deported and resettled in these towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires." Then the king of Assyria gave this order: "Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there, and teach the people what the God of this land requires." So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. So it is safe to assume that all the new inhabitants were circumcised and taught the Torah. One of the mildly sarcastic things about these verses is the reversing of the blessing to these non-Jewish inhabitants, who were given houses they didn't build and wells they didn't dig. So, what is meant by Isaiah's "the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken"? Well, since it's Matthew in question regarding the virgin birth prophecy, let's see what Matthew thought of the land of the Samaritans. In Jesus' instructions to send out the 12 to preach the gospel and heal the sick, Jesus gives special instructions regarding the land of the Samaritans. The land, it now seems, had become forsaken by God. These 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, "Do not go in the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans." God sends a priest through the king of Assyria in 2 Kings 17:27. But now God, at the time right before Jesus reached the age of maturity, decided to forsake the land of the Samaritans and send no one any longer. This seems like the most likely possibility. I'll be doing a part 2 shortly on the word virgin, but if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date on all my videos that will be coming out shortly.